The clipboard edges bit into my palms as I navigated the marble corridors of the Belmont estate, dodging waiters in crisp white shirts and guests draped in labels I couldn't pronounce. The afternoon sun poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished stone floors that probably cost more than I'd earn in a decade. It smelled of expensive floral arrangements, aged leather, and that particular scent of old money, a subtle mixture of confidence and casual cruelty that seemed to hang in the air like expensive perfume. "Excuse me, we need more champagne at the East Terrace." A woman in a dove-gray Chanel suit waved me over, her voice clipped and efficient. She didn't wait for my response before turning away, already dismissing me as part of the scenery. I was used to it by now. 8 months of coordinating events for the Belmont's elite clientele had taught me one crucial lesson: invisibility was part of the job description. My orange blazer, the brightest thing I owned, bought on clearance 3 years ago, felt like a beacon of wrongness among the sea of black, navy, and tasteful neutrals. The white pencil skirt I'd paired it with had a small stain near the hem I'd tried to bleach out last night. My sensible flats squeaked slightly on the marble, a stark contrast to the silent glide of designer heels surrounding me. My feet already throbbed, and we were only 90 minutes into the 4-hour spring charity luncheon. Building bridges for children, they called it. Though I doubted most of these people had ever crossed an actual bridge to the neighborhoods those children lived in. I'd taken this contract because Mom's second round of chemo started next week, and the hospital wanted payment up front for the medications insurance wouldn't cover. My regular event coordination jobs barely kept the lights on in my studio apartment in Riverside, the kind of neighborhood where you heard sirens more often than birdsong. Belmont paid triple my usual rate, but only because none of my competitors wanted to deal with their particular clientele. Code for dangerous. "Teresa, the auction items need to be repositioned, and don't forget you're introducing the speakers at 3. My contact at the estate, Catherine, appeared beside me, her perfectly styled silver hair not moving despite the breeze from the open terrace doors. "And please," her eyes flicked to my blazer with barely concealed distaste, "try to blend in." I nodded and headed toward the grand ballroom, but something made me slow my steps. Through the archway leading to the outdoor terrace, I spotted her, the little girl in the crimson dress. She sat alone on a stone bench near the garden entrance, small hands folded precisely in her lap, legs dangling well above the ground. While other children chased each other through the manicured hedges and shrieked with laughter near the fountain, she remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the pattern of the stone pavement. 1, 2, 3, 4. I could see her lips moving, counting the squares. Her dress was exquisite, silk taffeta with delicate hand embroidery, the kind that cost more than my monthly rent. Her dark hair was pulled back with a velvet ribbon that matched perfectly. But it was her complete isolation that made my chest tighten. In a space full of people, no one seemed to see her. I moved along the perimeter of the terrace, checking off items on my clipboard and making notes about the floral arrangements. Every few moments, my gaze drifted back to the girl. 2 women approached the bench, but instead of acknowledging the child, they simply sat at the opposite end, angling their bodies away from her as they gossiped. The girl didn't look up. "Teresa, table assignments for the seated portion need to be finalized, and Mrs. Haverford is asking about the vegan options." My assistant coordinator, Marcus, materialized beside me, stress radiating from every pore. "Also, he's here." "Who's here?" Marcus's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Wilson. John C. Wilson." The name sent a chill through the warm afternoon air. I had heard of him. The Phantom of the East Coast, they called him in whispered conversations. The kind of man whose name appeared in news articles with words like alleged and suspected, but never convicted. His business empire stretched from shipping to real estate, all of it legitimate on paper, all of it shadowed by rumors of what happened to people who crossed him. I turned toward the ballroom entrance, following Marcus's nervous glance. That's when I saw him. The crowd didn't part, it evaporated. Conversations died mid-laugh. Shoulders turned. Eyes found sudden interest in champagne flutes and canapes. John C. Wilson moved through the space like a blade through water, his presence creating a wake of silence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his black suit so perfectly tailored it might have been painted on. His dark hair was swept back from a face that could have been carved from granite, all sharp angles and controlled power. But it was his eyes that made my breath catch. Cold. Calculating. Missing nothing. He moved with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. My coordinator's instinct kicked in, track the VIP, ensure no complications. I watched as he crossed the terrace with measured steps, his path taking him directly toward the bench. The little girl. My clipboard nearly slipped from my hands. She looked up as he approached, and her whole face transformed. The careful blankness melted into pure, uncomplicated joy. She didn't jump up or run to him. Instead, she raised both hands and signed something I didn't understand. He knelt, this man who made senators nervous, and signed back, his large hands moving with surprising grace. Then he pressed a kiss to her forehead and stood, positioning himself slightly behind the bench. Not hovering. Not leaving. Guarding. The little girl in the crimson dress was his daughter. And as I watched a group of women in designer sundresses approach the bench, heard their voices float across the terrace, poor thing, what a shame. I heard she's completely nonverbal, damaged goods. I felt something hot and dangerous ignite in my chest. John C. Wilson's eyes shifted and found mine across the terrace. For a moment that stretched like pulled taffy, the most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard and an event coordinator in a clearance rack blazer locked gazes. Then his daughter's small hand reached up to tug his sleeve, her attention back on the stone patterns, and the moment shattered. But I knew, with the certainty of someone who'd just made a terrible mistake, that he'd seen something in my face. Recognition. Rage on behalf of his isolated child. Understanding. And I knew, even before I made my decision, that my carefully invisible life was about to become very, very visible. I forced my attention back to my clipboard, pretending to review seating arrangements I'd memorized hours ago. Professional detachment, that was the goal. Catherine's voice echoed in my head from my first day. You're here to coordinate events, not involve yourself in the personal lives of our guests. Especially not these guests. Sound advice. Practical advice. The kind that kept paychecks coming and trouble at bay. But detachment shattered the moment I noticed the pattern. A woman in a lavender Chanel suit approached the bench where Amelia sat, then veered sharply away when she registered the child's presence, her expression flickering from pleasant to uncomfortable in a heartbeat. She rejoined her companions, whispering something behind her hand that made them all glance back with practiced sympathy. Two children ran past, chasing each other toward the fountain. One started to approach Amelia, curiosity lighting his face, but his mother materialized instantly. Her hand clamped on his shoulder, steering him firmly in the opposite direction. No words needed. The message was clear. Amelia continued counting the stone squares, her lips moving silently. 1, 2, 3, 4. Start over. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her small shoulders hunched slightly forward, her father's jacket draped over them like armor against a world that had already decided she didn't belong. John C. Wilson stood 3 feet behind the bench, his posture deceptively relaxed. But I'd spent 8 months reading the body language of the wealthy and dangerous. I saw the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes tracked every person who passed his daughter. Every deliberate avoidance. Every pitying glance. God, is that Wilson's daughter? A voice carried from my left. A man in a summer blazer, holding court with a group near the terrace railing. I heard she's completely nonverbal. Can't even look you in the eye. Something wrong with her brain, another agreed, swirling his whiskey. Developmental issues. My wife knows someone on the board at Preston Academy. They wouldn't even consider her application. Can you blame them? Imagine having that in your classroom. The tantrums alone. The string quartet inside shifted to something louder, more celebratory. Wagner, maybe? The sound poured through the open terrace doors, washing over the crowd. Most guests didn't react beyond adjusting their conversation volume. Amelia's hands flew to her ears. Her whole body tensed, that careful stillness fracturing into visible distress. She began to rock, her eyes squeezed shut, small fingers pressed hard against her head as if she could physically block out the sensory assault. John C. Wilson moved with the fluid precision of someone trained for combat. He was beside her in 2 strides, kneeling so his large frame blocked most of the crowd's view. His hands moved in swift, practiced signs, questions, reassurance, options. Amelia shook her head frantically, her rocking intensifying. He stood, shrugged out of his jacket with economical grace, and draped it over her shoulders and head like a tent. The heavy fabric muted the light, created a small cave of darkness and quiet. Her rocking slowed immediately. "Ladies and gentlemen," Catherine's amplified voice rang out, "please make your way to your assigned tables. The luncheon service will begin momentarily." The crowd began its languid drift toward the seating area. John C. Wilson helped Amelia to her feet, the jacket still cocooning her, his hand steady on her shoulder as he guided her through the parting sea of designer clothes and judgment. Guests stepped back, not in deference, but in that particular way people avoid something they consider broken. I was marking table assignments on my clipboard when I heard them. 2 women in silk and pearls, their voices pitched just loud enough to carry. Such a tragedy, the first sighed, her tone dripping with false sympathy. All that power and wealth, and he's saddled with a defective child. "I heard she has violent episodes," her companion added, examining her manicure. "Completely uncontrollable. Can't function in normal society at all." "Well, what can you expect? It's genetic, isn't it?" His wife was probably. My feet were moving before my brain registered the decision. The clipboard clattered onto a nearby table. Catherine's rules about professional detachment, about not engaging, about keeping my head down and my mouth shut, all of it evaporated in the face of 2 women who thought cruelty was just another form of small talk. I crossed the terrace in 8 strides, my cheap blazer suddenly feeling less like a mark of poverty and more like battle armor. "Excuse me." My voice came out steady, professional, and cold enough to frost glass. "I believe you meant to say that the child is autistic, not defective." Both women turned toward me with identical expressions of startled offense, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly developed opinions. The one in pearls, her necklace probably worth more than my car, recovered first, her mouth curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "Teresa Morgan, event coordinator." I kept my voice level, my hands clasped in front of me in a posture of professional courtesy that barely contained the fury burning through my chest. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation, and I thought you might want to know that autism is a neurological difference, not a defect. The child you're discussing is a human being, not damaged goods." The second woman's silk blouse, diamond tennis bracelet catching the afternoon light, let out a small, incredulous laugh. "Darling, we were having a private conversation. On a public terrace. During an event I'm coordinating." The smile I gave them could have cut glass. "Where I'm responsible for ensuring all guests feel welcome and respected. Including children who process the world differently than you do." Pearl Necklace's eyes narrowed. "I don't think you understand your position here." "Oh, I understand my position perfectly, Mrs. Haverford. I'd memorized every name on the guest list, every face attached to every donation check. You're here supporting children's programs while actively mocking a child. I just thought you'd want to know how that looks." The color drained from her face, then flooded back in angry splotches. "How dare you? Is there a problem here?" A security guard materialized at my elbow, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the discreet earpiece that marked Belmont's private security. His hand hovered near my arm, not touching but threatening proximity. "No problem," I said, my voice still professionally pleasant. Just clarifying some terminology. Miss Morgan. His voice dropped low, meant only for me. Mrs. Haverford is a platinum-level patron. Perhaps you should return to your duties. The subtext was clear, know your place. I turned to face him fully, and something in my expression made him take a half step back. My duties include maintaining the dignity of this event. These ladies were discussing another guest in terms I'm certain Belmont wouldn't approve of. The coordinator is being incredibly rude, Silk Blouse interjected, her voice rising. We were simply having a conversation about how a child's neurodivergence makes her worthless. About genetic defects. I kept my tone light, conversational, but loud enough to carry to nearby guests who had started to notice the commotion. Please continue. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on children with disabilities while you're at an event supposedly raising money for their benefit. Several heads had turned now. A man with a camera, press, probably, covering the charity event, had shifted his lens in our direction. Pearl Necklace noticed, and her expression transformed from outrage to calculation in a heartbeat. I think there's been a misunderstanding, she said, her voice suddenly gracious, her smile returning with practiced ease. We were simply expressing concern. Save it. The words came out flat, final. I know exactly what I heard. The security guard's hand finally made contact with my elbow, his grip firm but not painful. Miss Morgan, I need you to come with me. Now. I let him steer me away from the two women, whose expressions had shifted to smug satisfaction. But as we passed the garden wall where John C. Wilson stood with his daughter, I felt it again, that weight of attention, that sense of being seen. He was watching me. His face remained impassive, unreadable as carved stone, but his dark eyes tracked my movement across the terrace with the focus of a predator assessing potential threat or prey. Amelia peeked out from beneath his jacket, her small face turned toward the commotion, her expression confused. The security guard pulled me through the terrace doors into the cool dimness of the estate's interior hallway. He released my arm and crossed his own, his expression hard. You want to explain what the hell that was? Those women were mocking a child. I corrected them. You confronted two of our most important donors. You embarrassed them in public. You made a scene. He stepped closer, using his height to intimidate. Your event staff, Miss Morgan. You set up chairs and check off lists. You don't get to lecture the guests, no matter what you think you heard. I know exactly what I heard. Then you should have ignored it. His voice dropped to something almost pitying. You think you're the first person to overhear rich people saying terrible things? This is how they are. You smile, you nod, you cash your check, and you keep your mouth shut. That's the job. Then maybe it's the wrong job. He studied me for a long moment, then shook his head. Catherine's going to fire you. Probably. Was it worth it? I thought about Amelia's small hands covering her ears, about the practiced way her father had created shelter for her, about two women who thought cruelty was just another form of entertainment. Yes. The security guard left me standing in the hallway with a warning to stay out of sight until Catherine decides what to do with you. I waited exactly 90 seconds before walking back out onto the terrace. If I was getting fired anyway, I might as well earn it properly. The luncheon service had begun, guests settling into their assigned seats, while white-gloved waiters circulated with wine and appetizers. The string quartet had shifted to something softer, Mozart maybe, the notes drifting through the warm afternoon air like silk ribbons. Amelia sat at the isolated table near the garden wall, her father's jacket still draped over her shoulders despite the heat. John C. Wilson had taken the chair beside her, angled so he could watch both his daughter and the crowd simultaneously. A plate of untouched food sat in front of Amelia. She was folding her napkin into increasingly complex shapes, her concentration absolute. I crossed the terrace with my clipboard abandoned, my sensible flats clicking against stone in a rhythm that felt like a countdown. Several guests noticed me, their conversations faltering as they registered my trajectory. Pearl Necklace actually gasped, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. I didn't care. John C. Wilson's head turned as I approached, his dark eyes locking onto me with laser focus. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to turn around, to remember that this man's reputation was built on making problems disappear. But I thought about all those people who had walked past his daughter like she was invisible, who had whispered diagnoses and judgments like she couldn't feel their disdain. I stopped 3 feet from their table and did something that probably violated a dozen unspoken rules of propriety and power dynamics. I knelt. Not beside John C. Wilson. Beside Amelia. Her hands stilled on the napkin. She didn't look at me, her gaze remained fixed on the white linen, but her head tilted slightly, acknowledging my presence in that careful way that suggested she was listening with every fiber of her being. "Hi, Amelia," I said softly. "My name is Teresa. I noticed you sitting here by yourself, and I wondered if you might like to dance with me." The terrace had gone silent. Even the string quartet seemed to fade into background noise, the world narrowing to this one moment, this one impossible request. Amelia's fingers twitched on the napkin. She glanced sideways at me, just for a heartbeat, her brown eyes uncertain. I held out my hand, palm up, not reaching for her but offering. "You don't have to if you don't want to. But I think you'd be an excellent dance partner. And I promise I'll go slow." Behind me, I heard the scrape of a chair. Footsteps. The crowd's collective intake of breath. But I kept my focus on Amelia, kept my hand extended, kept my expression open and gentle and completely devoid of pity. She looked at her father. I didn't turn to see his response, didn't dare break this fragile moment by acknowledging the threat that was probably advancing toward me with murderous intent. Then Amelia's small hand slipped into mine. The crowd's gasp was audible this time. I stood slowly, carefully, and led her away from the table toward the open space near the fountain. The orchestra music swelled, and I placed her small feet on top of mine the way my own father had done when I was small and the world felt too big. "Just like this," I murmured. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. "You don't have to look at me. You can close your eyes if that helps." We swayed together, a splash of orange and crimson in a sea of muted elegance. Amelia's hands gripped mine tightly, her small body rigid with concentration, but she was moving with me, trusting me, letting me guide her through this small act of defiance and joy. That's when I felt it, the temperature drop, the prickling awareness that something dangerous had moved into my immediate space. I turned my head and found John C. Wilson standing less than 2 feet away. His expression was unreadable, his stillness more terrifying than any overt aggression could be. The crowd had formed a wide circle around us, phones raised, faces twisted with anticipation of violence or scandal, or both. Catherine stood near the terrace doors, her face drained of color, one hand pressed to her chest. I had miscalculated catastrophically. This wasn't just a man who could fire me. This was a man who could make me disappear. And I was dancing with his daughter without permission in front of everyone who mattered in this world. My mouth went dry. My feet stopped moving, though Amelia continued swaying slightly, her eyes still closed, lost in the music and the simple rhythm we'd created. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, to apologize, to somehow undo the last 5 minutes of spectacular professional suicide. But John C. Wilson didn't speak, didn't reach for his daughter, didn't signal to the security personnel I could now see positioned at strategic points around the terrace. Instead, he did something that sent a ripple of pure shock through the assembled elite. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and dark with notes of cedar and smoke, and carefully, deliberately, removed his suit jacket from Amelia's shoulders. The afternoon breeze was warm, but he folded the jacket over his arm with meticulous precision, as if this were the most important task in the world. Then he moved to stand beside us. Not between us. Beside us. The crowd's murmur rose like a wave. Phones lifted higher. Pearl Necklace looked like she might faint into her lobster bisque. Again, John C. Wilson said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying absolute, unquestionable authority. Not a request. A command. I blinked, certain I'd misheard. But Amelia's hands tightened in mine, and when I looked down, her eyes had opened. She was looking at me now, really looking, and something that might have been a smile ghosted across her small face. So I danced with her again. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The orchestra continued playing, and the most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard stood guard while his daughter swayed on my feet, her crimson dress bright against my orange blazer, two splashes of defiant color in a world of carefully controlled neutrals. I don't know how long it lasted. Time felt elastic, stretched thin by adrenaline and the surreal impossibility of the moment. But eventually the song ended, the final notes fading into the afternoon air. John C. Wilson extended his hand to his daughter. Amelia stepped off my feet and took it, her fingers disappearing into his large palm. She signed something to him, a quick, fluid motion I didn't understand, and he nodded, signing back. Then he looked at me. It wasn't a long look. Maybe 3 seconds. But in that brief moment, his dark eyes held something I couldn't quite identify. Not gratitude, exactly. Not a threat, either. Something more complex, more weighted with meaning I couldn't parse. He turned without a word and led Amelia away, the crowd parting like water before a ship. I stood frozen in place, my heart hammering so hard I thought my ribs might crack, while conversations slowly resumed around me in hushed, excited tones. Miss Morgan. A voice at my elbow made me jump. A man in a dark suit materialized beside me, not security, something else. Professional. Dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with purpose. I need to collect your contact information. My stomach dropped. I don't. Phone number. Address. Email. He produced a small leather notebook and an expensive pen, his expression pleasant and utterly implacable. Mr. Wilson's instructions. I didn't mean any disrespect, I heard myself say, the words tumbling out. I just wanted her to feel included. I wasn't trying to. Your information, please. My hands shook as I recited my phone number, my email, my apartment address in Riverside that suddenly felt even more pathetic when spoken aloud to a man who probably lived somewhere with more than one bathroom. He wrote everything down in neat, precise script, then closed the notebook with a soft snap. Someone will be in touch. He started to walk away, then paused, turning back with something that might have been sympathy flickering across his otherwise blank expression. For what it's worth, Miss Morgan, Mr. Wilson doesn't typically collect contact information from people he intends to harm. Then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd like smoke. I stood there in the middle of the terrace, surrounded by the wealthy and dangerous, my orange blazer suddenly feeling like a target painted on my back. Catherine was advancing toward me with murder in her eyes. The security guard from earlier watched me with grim satisfaction. Pearl necklace and silk blouse were whispering behind their hands, their expressions hungry for my downfall. But all I could think about was that unreadable look in John C. Wilson's eyes, and the terrifying uncertainty of what someone will be in touch actually meant. 3 days passed. 3 days of jumping every time my phone buzzed, of checking my rearview mirror obsessively, of barely sleeping in my studio apartment while sirens wailed outside and my imagination conjured increasingly creative ways the phantom of the East Coast might make me regret my moment of compassion. Catherine had fired me, naturally. A brief, venomous phone call about professional boundaries and embarrassing the estate, and never working in this city again. I'd lost the Belmont contract, which meant I'd lost 1/3 of my income, which meant Mom's treatment schedule was now a terrifying question mark. So I picked up extra shifts at Rosie's Diner, the kind of place where the coffee was perpetually burnt and the vinyl booths were held together with duct tape and prayer. Tuesday dinner rush, my feet already screaming in protest, my apron stained with ketchup and the regrets of every life choice that had led me here. Order up, Teresa. Danny shouted from the kitchen window, sliding 2 plates of meatloaf across the counter with the precision of someone who'd been doing this for 30 years. I delivered the plates to table 7, refilled coffee at table 3, and was clearing dishes from table 5 when the bell above the door chimed. The man who entered didn't belong in Rosie's diner. His suit probably cost more than I made in 6 months. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine. His expression was professionally blank in a way that made every survival instinct I possessed start screaming. He walked directly to my section, ignoring the hostess stand, ignoring Jenna, who tried to intercept him with a laminated menu. He stopped at the booth I was clearing and waited, silent and immovable as a monument. "Can I help you?" My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Teresa C. Morgan?" My blood turned to ice water. "Yes." He reached into his jacket. I actually flinched and withdrew a cream-colored envelope. Heavy paper, expensive. The kind that announced importance before you even opened it. From Mr. Wilson. He placed it on the table between us, then stepped back, his hands clasped in front of him. Waiting. My fingers trembled as I picked up the envelope. No name on the front, just a wax seal pressed with an intricate emblem. I broke it and pulled out the contents. $8,000 in crisp $100 bills. A handwritten note on cardstock that probably cost more per sheet than my entire outfit, for seeing what others refused to. And a phone number. Oh my God. Jenna's voice came from behind me, high and frightened. She was staring at the emblem on the card, her face drained of color. "Teresa, that's the Wilson family crest. That's John C. Wilson." Danny had emerged from the kitchen, his perpetual skull deepening. "What the hell is going on out here?" "She knows Wilson," Jenna whispered, backing away from me like I'd just announced I had a contagious disease. "She knows the Phantom." The diner had gone silent. Every customer, every server, every line cook, all of them staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to horror to the kind of morbid fascination people reserve for car accidents and public executions. "Miss Morgan." The stone-faced man's voice cut through the silence. "There's a car waiting outside. Mr. Wilson requests your presence at his estate. Now." "I'm working," I said stupidly, my brain struggling to process the cash in my hands, the note, the sudden weight of everyone's attention. "I've been authorized to compensate your employer for the inconvenience." He produced a money clip, peeled off several bills, and placed them on the counter. More than I'd make in a week of shifts. Danny took the money without a word. "I don't understand," I said. "What does he want?" "That's between you and Mr. Wilson." The man gestured toward the door. "The car is waiting." I looked at the envelope in my hands, at the money that could cover Mom's next 2 treatment sessions, at the note that suggested this might not be a punishment after all. Then I looked at Jenna's terrified face, at Danny's grim expression, at the other customers who were already pulling out their phones to text about this moment. "If I go with you," I heard myself ask, "am I coming back?" For the first time, something flickered across the man's professionally blank expression. It might have been amusement. "Mr. Wilson doesn't typically summon people to his estate to harm them, Miss Morgan. He has more efficient methods for that." He paused. "The car is waiting." I untied my apron with shaking hands, grabbed my purse from the back room, and followed him out into the twilight where a black Mercedes idled at the curb, and my carefully invisible life finally, irrevocably ended. The Wilson estate sat behind iron gates and stone walls that screamed old money and older secrets. The Mercedes glided up a tree-lined drive that seemed to stretch for miles, past manicured gardens and marble fountains, until the main house emerged from the twilight like something out of a Gothic novel. 3 stories of limestone and glass, with wings that stretched in both directions and lights glowing in windows that suggested rooms I couldn't even imagine. The stone-faced man opened my door, gestured toward the entrance where another man in a dark suit waited. I followed on legs that felt disconnected from my body, through doors that probably weighed more than my car, into a foyer with ceilings so high my footsteps echoed. This way, Miss Morgan. The new escort led me through corridors lined with art that looked museum quality, past rooms glimpsed through doorways, a library, a sitting room, something that might have been a ballroom, until we reached a set of double doors carved with intricate designs. He knocked once, waited for a response I didn't hear, then opened the doors and stepped aside. John C. Wilson stood behind a massive desk in what was clearly his study. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, leather furniture, a fireplace where flames crackled despite the warm evening. He looked different without the crowd, without the performance of civility. More dangerous, somehow. More real. Miss Morgan, please sit. He gestured to one of the leather chairs facing his desk. I sat because my knees were threatening to give out anyway. He didn't sit. Instead, he moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back, his profile sharp against the darkening sky. The silence stretched until I thought I might scream just to break it. My daughter doesn't speak, he said finally, his voice quiet and precise. Not because she can't, but because the world has given her very little worth responding to. Most people treat her as if she's broken. A problem to be fixed or hidden. An embarrassment. I stayed silent, sensing that any response would be the wrong one. 3 days ago, you treated her like a person. He turned to face me, his dark eyes unreadable. You didn't ask for my permission. You didn't ask for her medical history or her diagnosis or her behavioral plan. You simply asked if she wanted to dance. She looked lonely, I said quietly. No child should look that lonely. Something flickered across his face, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. No, they shouldn't. He moved to lean against the desk, closer now, but not threateningly so. I'm told you lost your position at the Belmont because of what happened. I lost it because I confronted guests who were mocking your daughter. So I heard. His mouth curved slightly, though it wasn't quite a smile. Mrs. Haverford is still complaining to anyone who'll listen about the uppity event coordinator who humiliated her. I'm sorry if I caused problems for her. Don't. The word was soft, but absolute. Don't apologize for defending my daughter. I've buried bodies for less. The casual way he said it made my blood run cold. He noticed my expression and nodded, acknowledging the fear. I'm not a good man, Miss Morgan. I've done things that would keep you awake at night. I've built an empire on violence and fear and the exploitation of human weakness. He paused, his gaze holding mine. But I am a father first. And I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let anyone harm my child. Why am I here? My voice came out barely above a whisper. Because Amelia smiled after you danced with her. A genuine smile. The first I've seen in months. He moved back to his desk, opened a drawer, and withdrew a folder. I want to hire you. What? Not a therapist. Not a nanny. Not a behavioral specialist who thinks she needs to be trained like a dog. His voice hardened on those last words. I want you to be someone who treats her like the complete, intelligent, remarkable human being she is. Someone who sees her, not her diagnosis. I don't have any special training. You're someone who saw a lonely child and offered her kindness without calculation or ulterior motive. He slid the folder across the desk. That's rarer than you think. Especially in my world. I opened the folder. A contract. A salary that made my vision blur. Benefits that included coverage for my mother's medical care. The world is cruel to people like Amelia, John C. Wilson said quietly. But I make certain the cruel people remember their manners around my family. You've already proven you understand that. I'm simply asking you to continue. I looked up at him, at this man who terrified an entire city, who had just casually mentioned burying bodies, who was offering me salvation wrapped in danger. What if I say no? Then you walk out of here with the money from the envelope, no strings attached, and we never speak again. He paused. But I don't think you will. Why not? Because you're still thinking about how lonely she looked. And you can't walk away from that any more than I can. He was right. God help me, he was right. I signed the contract with hands that only shook slightly, my cheap pen looking absurd against the expensive paper. Each stroke of ink felt like sealing a pact with something far more binding than employment, a crossing into a world where people like me didn't typically survive, let alone thrive. "She's upstairs, John C., Wilson said, sliding the signed contract back into the folder with the careful precision that seemed to characterize everything he did. "She knows you're here. She's been asking about you." Asking. The word came out before I could stop it. I thought she didn't speak. She signs. And she communicates in other ways when she chooses to. He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at me with an expression I was beginning to recognize as his version of uncertainty. "She's drawn 17 pictures of you in 3 days. All of them feature an orange blazer and someone kneeling." Something in my chest cracked open at that image. A lonely child, processing the world through art, holding on to a moment when someone had seen her as worthy of dancing with. I followed him through the maze of corridors, up a sweeping staircase, down a hallway lined with photographs I didn't have time to examine. He stopped at a door painted pale yellow, the only splash of color I'd seen in this entire austere mansion, and knocked softly. A moment later, the door opened. Amelia stood in the doorway wearing cotton pajamas covered in stars, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her feet bare. When she saw me, her whole face transformed. Not just a smile, something bigger, brighter, unguarded in a way that made my throat tighten. She signed something rapid and excited, her hands moving too fast for me to follow even if I'd known the language. "She wants to know if you'll dance with her," John C. Wilson translated, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Something soft. Something that might have been hope. "Always," I said, kneeling so I was at Amelia's eye level. "Anytime you want." Amelia launched herself forward, her small arms wrapping around my neck in a hug that drove the air from my lungs. I held her carefully, this child who'd been called broken and defective, who'd been systematically ignored by people who should have known better, who'd somehow decided that I was worthy of her trust. Over her shoulder, I caught John C. Wilson's expression. The dangerous man, the phantom, the legend who made senators nervous and enemies disappear. He was watching his daughter embrace me with something that looked almost like vulnerability. Raw and unguarded, and quickly shuddered away, but I'd seen it. The fear that this might not last. The desperate hope that it would. Amelia pulled back, signing something else, then tugged my hand, trying to pull me into her room. "She wants to show you her drawings," he said quietly. "And to plan your next dance. She has opinions about music selection, apparently." I let her lead me into her room, a space filled with art supplies and books and soft textures, nothing clinical or therapeutic about it, just a child's space designed for comfort. Her walls were covered in drawings, and yes, there I was, 17 versions of a woman in orange kneeling before a girl in red. "I'll leave you two to discuss music," John C. Wilson said from the doorway. But he didn't leave. He stood there, watching his daughter's excited gestures, watching me nod and respond even though I barely understood, watching this fragile new connection with the intensity of someone who'd learned the hard way that good things were rarely permanent. And I realized, as Amelia showed me drawing after drawing, explaining in signs and sounds and pure enthusiasm what each one meant, that I had crossed a threshold I could never uncross. I was no longer invisible. I was seen, by a child who desperately needed someone to see her back, and by a man who would destroy anyone who threatened what we were building here. I was safe from poverty, from my mother's medical bills, from the grinding uncertainty of living paycheck to paycheck. But I was also no longer safe in any way that mattered. I'd entered the orbit of the Phantom of the East Coast, and people in his orbit didn't live quiet, invisible lives. They lived spectacular ones, for however long those lives lasted. Amelia tugged my sleeve, pointing to a drawing of two figures dancing under stars, and signed something that her father translated with unmistakable warmth. "She says you promised to go slow. She wants to know if you'll keep that promise." I looked at this little girl who'd chosen to trust me, at this dangerous man who'd chosen to let her, at the elaborate drawings that suggested I'd somehow become important in a world I barely understood. Always, I said again, and meant it with every fiber of my being. Even knowing what that promise might cost me. Even knowing I'd already changed in ways I couldn't undo. Even knowing that invisible and safe were luxuries I no longer possessed. I was visible now. And visibility in John C. Wilson's world was its own kind of beautiful danger. I forced my attention back to my clipboard, checking off the auction items that line the east wall of the terrace. Vintage wine collections. A week at someone's villa in Tuscany. A private concert with some performer whose name meant nothing to me but everything to these people. My pen scratched across the paper, but my peripheral vision remained locked on the bench where John C. Wilson stood sentinel over his daughter. Professional detachment. That's what Catherine had drilled into me during my orientation. These people aren't your friends, Teresa. They're not even really your clients. Your infrastructure. You don't participate. Sound advice for someone who needed to pay bills and couldn't afford to care about the personal dramas of the wealthy and dangerous. But detachment became impossible the moment I noticed the pattern. A cluster of women in pastel Hermes scarves drifted past the bench, their laughter bright and sharp as breaking glass. One glanced at Amelia, her smile faltering for just a fraction of a second before she deliberately turned away, steering her companions in a wide arc. As if proximity to the child might be contagious. A man in a navy blazer collected his son, a boy about Amelia's age, from near the fountain. The boy started to approach the bench, curiosity written across his round face, but his father's hand clamped on his shoulder. A quick head shake. A redirection toward the dessert table. The unspoken message is clear. Stay away from that one. Amelia seemed oblivious, her focus absolute as she traced patterns only she could see in the stonework. But John C. Wilson noticed everything. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly with each subtle rejection, each careful avoidance. His hands, I noticed, had curled into fists at his sides. Is that really his daughter? Marcus whispered, appearing at my elbow with a tray of fresh champagne flutes. I heard she doesn't talk. My cousin works security for the Haverford family, and he said she's got something wrong with her. You know, he tapped his temple mentally. The casual cruelty of it made my teeth clench. She's autistic, Marcus. Not broken. He blinked at my sharp tone. Yeah, sure. Same thing though, right? Must be rough for a guy like Wilson. All that power and money, and he gets a defective. Don't. The word came out harder than I intended. Don't finish that sentence. Marcus raised his hands in surrender, backing away with his tray. Jesus, Teresa. Just making conversation. But the damage was done. I could feel the anger building in my chest, hot and righteous and completely unprofessional. This was exactly what Catherine had warned against. Getting involved. Caring about things that weren't my business. I watched as two teenage girls in designer sundresses posed for selfies near the bench, angling their phones to deliberately exclude Amelia from the frame. One made a comment I couldn't hear, and both erupted into laughter. John C. Wilson's head turned toward them with the precision of a predator tracking prey. The girls felt his attention like a physical thing. They paled, grabbed their phones, and fled toward the safety of the buffet tables. Good, I thought viciously. Be afraid. Amelia's hands had moved from tracing patterns to covering her ears. The string quartet inside had shifted to something louder, more energetic. The chatter around the terrace had increased in volume as more guests arrived for the seated luncheon. Too much input. Too much noise. Her small body began to rock, almost imperceptibly. John C. Wilson crouched immediately, his large frame folding with surprising grace. His hands moved in that silent language again, signing, I realized. Asking a question. Offering something. Amelia's rocking slowed, but didn't stop. She shook her head, her ribbon slipping slightly. He stood, removed his suit jacket in one fluid motion, and draped it over her shoulders. The black fabric swallowed her small frame, but she pulled it tighter around herself immediately. A barrier. A shield. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could begin making your way to your assigned tables. Catherine's voice rang out across the terrace, amplified and false bright. Luncheon service will begin in 10 minutes. The crowd began its lazy migration toward the seating area. John C. Wilson helped his daughter to her feet, his hand gentle on her shoulder as he guided her toward a table near the garden wall, deliberately isolated from the others. And as they walked, I heard it. Two women in silk blouses in judgment, their voices carrying in that particular way that suggested they didn't care who heard. Such a shame, the first one sighed, adjusting her pearl necklace. All that wealth and he's stuck with damaged goods. I heard she has tantrums, the second added, lowering her voice to a theatrical whisper. Screaming fits in public. Can you imagine? A man like that, forced to deal with a child who can't even function normally. It's genetic, you know. His wife probably. My feet were moving before my brain caught up with the decision.